let's go on and let's talk about sort of what the U.S. ag economy situation and outlook is. Let's start off with net farm income. This has been a good year, hasn't it? I mean, we've had good commodity prices, at least in the Southeast. We've had pretty good weather, so we've got good, decent yields this year. We've had a good fall to harvest our crops in, and input prices have been a little slow to catch up. So we're looking at a good net farm income for 2021. The last time that USDA made a forecast of this was back in February, so it's been out for a while. But you'll notice that their forecast, which is the blue line out there for 20 and 21, the blue, but before that is the actual net farm income. Their forecast is that net farm income is going to be down just slightly from 2020. So why would that be? Well, the reason is because government payments are going to be lower. Government payments in 2020 were over $46 billion to U.S. farmers, and that's the largest that had been in a number of years. In fact, if you look down at that yellow portion of the line for 2019 through 2021, you'll see that's USDA's forecast if we had not had the CFAP payments. And so you can see net farm income would have been very substantially below the blue line, and it would have been down substantially without those net farm payments, or without those farm payments. Okay, and so here's another way to look at that. This is an index of crop prices received, and the red one is an index of inputs paid for by crop farmers. Now, don't get confused with the fact that one index is over the other one. That doesn't mean we're incurring a loss. It just shows you the change over time in these prices. And you can see that our crop prices, our commodity prices went up very substantially there in 2021. And that was good news for us. And the nice news was, yes, input prices did start going up, but at least for the 2021 season, a lot of us were able to get those bought before they went so high. So it gave us a good profit margin for a change. It's been a number of years since we had a good year like this, so we needed one. And the same thing with livestock. If we look at livestock, we can see that, yes, input prices are rising, but thankfully, livestock prices rose more quickly than input prices did in 2021. Now, the concern is as we roll into 2022, and I know everybody's talking about this. Every time I'm with a group of farmers this fall, this is basically what we talk about. What's going to happen to input prices as we roll into the 2022 year? Because we're thinking that commodity prices are continue to be pretty strong. I mean, you never know what will happen, but at this point, it looks like it's not going to be a problem with the prices that we receive. The problem and in the anxiety that we have is over what prices we're going to have to pay for inputs. This is a forecast from some of my colleagues out at the University of Illinois. It looks at corn non-land cost, and you can see they have forecasts for 2022 that they're going up substantially. The same for soybean non-land cost. And then if you look down at the very bottom, fertilizer, you can see that that's going up too. And that's a big source of some of the increases that we're anticipating for 2022. And in fact, this is another graph from my friends out at the University of Illinois. It's a really interesting one because the orange line, the faint orange line, is corn prices, dollars per bushel. And you can see that over on the right side. The black line is anhydrous ammonia prices, dollars per ton. And that's the one over on the left axis. And then the bottom line is the blue line. That is natural gas prices. And that's represented in dollars per million BTU over on the right side. But what you'll see here is they're going up in tandem. And in fact, if you look back over time, there's a correlation there. And so there's a strong correlation with something like anhydrous ammonia with natural gas, which of course is one of the big inputs for manufacturing anhydrous ammonia, so no surprise there. But there's also a big correlation with corn prices. And so it's a little hard to sift out the cause and effect, but we're seeing corn prices have risen substantially. They still look strong for 2022. Natural gas prices are up, and no surprise, anhydrous ammonia prices are up very substantially as well. And this is the same for other types of fertilizer. This is a graph of anhydrous ammonia, which is the blue line, diammonium phosphate, which is the red line, and potash, the green line. And you can see for all of the three major categories of fertilizer, prices are escalating rapidly for 2021. What's going on here? I'm not totally sure. I mean, we can look at nitrate prices and say part of that has to do with natural gas prices going up. And there's a lot of things that have to do with that. Just the economy coming back and increased demand for manufacturing goods that people weren't able to buy earlier. So there's some competition there. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with potash and phosphate. Part of it has to do with transportation, because we do bring in a lot of phosphate from overseas, although we have a big mine here in North Carolina, and potash comes from outside the US to a great extent as well. So part of this, I'm sure, is transportation. And as we know, a lot of things in the economy are really getting snarled up in terms of trying to get goods transported either by truck or even through ports by boat or train. So a lot of things going on here. And I know the hard decisions for farmers, and I wished I knew what the answer was, is do I go ahead and buy some of these inputs now and try to make sure I've got them on hand, or do I wait and hope the price is not quite as bad as it looks now? It's a hard decision, because waiting, one of the risk is that what if I can't get what I need? And this story is also true for ag chemicals, all kinds of products, unfortunately, that we see. So this is our big concern rolling into 2022, are these escalating input prices, as well as just the availability of some of these inputs. This is another, just again, this is urea ammonium nitrate prices, just another way of showing what we were just talking about. The red line is 2021 prices, so you can see how it's escalated throughout the year. This is January through December. And then if you look compared to, say, 2019 and 2020, when prices actually went down over the year for urea ammonium nitrate. So big concern. And of course, fertilizer is such a big component of what we do. You know, we have to look at that really careful. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about trade. This is a graph that you've seen before if you've seen my Outlook presentation. I want to tell people what trade sort of looks like for the US. And the main thing to emphasize here is that, yes, that big red line coming from China, China is a huge trading partner. But, you know, over the past decade, we have spent so much time talking about China, sometimes we forget about our other major trading partners. If you look at Canada and Mexico, in terms of exports from the US, they are much larger partners than China is, much more important. And even if you go to the European Union, and when you start aggregating those countries together, they're very important trading partners. So the US has a really healthy trade economy, and that's especially true of agriculture. And so, you know, for example, Canada and Mexico, really important markets for our peanuts. And Mexico, until China had to start buying pork because of African swine fever, was our biggest customer for US pork. So very important that we think about these other countries. Now, sometimes we talk about trade and we get all tied up talking about trade policy, but the truth is exchange rates always have a big year-to-year effect. And so what we saw back in 2020 was we saw the dollar weakening. And this graph is just US dollars per euro, which is a pretty good measure of the strength of the dollar. And we saw that it took more dollars to buy 1 euro's worth of stuff, but that's good because it meant it took fewer euros to buy $1 worth of stuff, which is good for export markets. So this has helped our export markets. We see that exchange rates have just kind of rocked along at an even level in 2021, but those changes we saw back in 2020 really helped us out on the export side, which of course is very important to US agriculture. If you look at just some of the different products, this graph is a little bit deceiving because it's dwarfed by what's going on in soybeans. Soybeans is the purple line, and you see that huge spike in the last quarter of 2020. Yes, it's tailed off a lot in 2021, but they're still strong. But other products increased as well, especially corn. But also, even though it doesn't look as dramatic on this graph, products like pork, cotton, poultry, those all increased very substantially as well. And so let's just look at a little bit of the source of that. And yes, it is China. China played a big part in the increase of the exports of all these products, especially soybeans. If you look at soybeans, for example, you will see that that China comprised half of their U.S. exports of soybeans in 2020, basically. Other countries had rocked along kind of the same level, but China escalated rapidly. And so what's going on there? Well, basically, it has to do with African swine fever. African swine fever decimated the Chinese swine herd back in 2018 and 2019. They have been really coming back strong, building this swine herd back. And in order to do that, they've had to really ramp up imports of soybeans and corn. And so we've seen a very positive effect on both our soybean markets and our corn markets because of this. And I'll say a little bit more about African swine fever in a minute. But it's not just corn and soybeans. Here's one that's really important to us in the Carolinas and Virginia and Georgia. Look at peanuts. If you look at peanut exports and you look all the way back to 2010, most of our peanut exports go to Canada and Mexico, where they're often made into confectionaries or other products and then re-exported to the US. But we've seen in the last few years, China become an increasing customer. Now, this is interesting because China also produces a lot of peanuts, but they in 2020 imported a lot of US peanuts. So that helped our market out too. And so we've seen peanut exports from the US increase in the last few years, which has helped us with disappearance or use of peanuts. Also cotton. This one's a little bit harder to see. If you look all the way over to the right, you see 2021. If you look back to 2020, you'll see that cotton exports from the US were increasing, and the blue portion of that graph is China. And some of that increase was due to China. And there's a lot of things going on there, but part of that is a policy that was left over from the Trump administration. He basically banned the use of any cotton from a particular Chinese province because of alleged human rights abuse in that province. And so that was China's largest cotton producing province. So they had to scramble, their manufacturers have had to scramble to find cotton from other sources to use in manufacture of clothing to send back to the US. So that meant that they were buying more US cotton to make it into clothes and ship it back here. Now, you don't see it fully in that other part of that's why, because China brings in cotton, oftentimes not directly from the US, they bring it in via other countries around them. And so if we could look at imports of US cotton by China and look at the source, I think we'd see this a little differently. Unfortunately, that data is a little harder to get, but I had privy to that kind of data when I worked at the White House. And so it was interesting to see that that was always a little different, because a lot of times products go in a roundabout way rather than directly to a country. But China's still important. And of course, here we go. Flue-cured tobacco, very important in North Carolina, but also in South Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia. You know, we were really pleased to be exporting tobacco to China for a number of years. Really a strong market for the US, 60 to 80 million pounds, depending on the year. And so whenever the trade war started in 2018, China said that they would stop importing any US tobacco. And of course, the Chinese Tobacco Company is a state-run monopoly and the biggest tobacco company in the world. And so whenever they just changed their mind and said, nope, trade war, we're not going to import any US tobacco, you can see that the blue portion of that graph, which represents exports of US tobacco to China, just went to nothing. They stopped in 2019. They essentially stopped importing any US tobacco. And that was devastating. We went to the lowest amount of flue-cured tobacco produced in over 100 years. Now they've come back, and I'll say a little bit more about that later, but that's been really important because it's caused our flue-cured tobacco production in 2021 to rebound to around 300 million pounds. And that's because China has entered the market again. Here's the issue with China that we just kind of have to keep in mind. You know, we really thought China was a panacea, and I think a lot of policymakers thought that The more economic prosperity China had, the greater would be the move towards democracy. But that's really not been the case. There are lots of issues with China. It doesn't matter which side of the aisle in Washington that you talk to, China is seen as a security threat. They're seen as a rival in the world in terms of military power. And they also are seen as very manipulative with regard to economic policy and trade. So we enter into this decade with a fairly skeptical view of China. So it doesn't mean that China is not going to be an important market for us. They are. They need our products, and we need their products too. So they're going to continue to be an important trade partner. But that trade relationship is going to be strained because of these issues. And it's going to be subject to policy risk, is what I would call it. You know, if you have sanctions, if you have a trade war, if you have any kind of adverse situation between the countries, it can affect trade. And that's what we saw back in the Trump administration. Those kinds of things can happen again. It's a little less important for commodities that are purchased by, quote, private companies in China. And that's a whole different discussion in itself. But for a commodity like tobacco that is bought by a state-run monopoly, it makes us even more vulnerable to these policy fluctuations. So this is just something we have to keep in mind. And the main implication I would say of this is that we really need to focus on cultivating our export markets with other parts of the world. We were really a little too focused on China. And so we're going to have to really look at our portfolio of customers worldwide and make sure we maintain the strength of that. Okay. Let me just speak a little bit about phase one. This is a trade agreement put into place by the Trump administration. It is still in place under the Biden administration. They have not changed it. It's called phase one, and it set targets for China to meet in terms of exports, of purchases of U.S. products in order for us to release trade restrictions on their products coming to the U.S. For example, this is 2021, and the target for this year was that China would import $207 billion worth of U.S. goods. As of June, the middle of this year, they had their target was supposed to have been 99 billion, about half of the total year, and they had only imported about $68 billion worth of goods. So they were behind on the target. But to put this in perspective, that's still more than they usually import from us. So these targets were pretty ambitious. And if we look specifically at agriculture, this is 2020, last year. The target for 2020 was that China would import $36.6 billion worth of U.S. agricultural goods. They actually only imported $23.6 billion. So they missed the target by a substantial amount. But again, to put this in perspective, I think the most that they had ever imported in any one year was about $26 billion, if I remember correctly. So it's still a lot of U.S. exports to China as a result of this phase one agreement. And as I mentioned, this agreement is still in place. Let me just say one more word about African swine fever, because it was, you've heard me talk about it a number of times over the last few years. It was probably the biggest disruption in global agriculture that I've seen in my career. They basically lost 40% of their swine herd. That's 20% of the global swine herd, because they were producing half the world's pork and they were consuming half the world's pork. They have had a very, very aggressive campaign to build their pork production back. That means that they have swung from smallholders to largely commercial production. They've done a good job at that, and they've been putting the biosecurity in place so that they're not devastated by this disease again. And that's why we saw back in 2018 and 19 huge imports of U.S. pork to China. That's tapered off as they've got their pork production coming back. And now, as we saw earlier, they're importing huge quantities of U.S. soybeans and corn to feed this swine herd that they've brought back into production. So the comment I would say is their domestic policy on pork production is going to shape the imports of pork and poultry and soybeans and corn for the U.S. for years to come. It's very important. And China's going to be a bellwether to look at in terms of meat production, because the other thing that's looming out there on the horizon that's a long-term issue is lab cultured meat. And it's in production in a number of countries, being introduced into markets around the world. I saw where China was conducting a consumer acceptance survey, and I forgot which city it was in, but in one of their large cities, consumer acceptance of lab-grown chicken meat. So China's going to be at the forefront of producing meat for their people, and they're going to look at this lab-grown meat phenomena real carefully. And that's one 10 to 20 years down the road that could turn states like North Carolina upside down if it moves forward. So just something for the distant future to keep in mind. Okay, let's switch gears, talk a little bit about peanuts. Again, as I mentioned earlier, very important to Virginia all the way into especially Georgia. If we look at peanut use, peanuts is one of those commodities that benefited from the pandemic. Peanut use in all categories went up. Now, it wasn't surprising that peanut butter use went up, because when people stayed home more, they seemed to eat more peanut butter. Good thing, right? We were a little concerned about in-shell peanuts. That's what we produce mostly in North Carolina and Virginia, and to some extent in South Carolina. In-shell peanuts, we were a little worried about it because those are often sold at events like ball games. And so with a lot of events being canceled, we were concerned that people might not eat as many. That even use of in-shell peanuts was up in for the last crop year, 2021. And so I guess people are buying those Hampton Farm in-shell peanuts and other in-shell peanuts when they go buy Tractor Supply at the grocery store, and they're eating them at home now. So that's good. So we saw all categories, whether it was candy, snacks, peanut butter, or in-shell peanuts, go up for peanuts. And so that was good. And so we've got a strong peanut market this year, you know, with good prices for our peanuts. And my understanding is most of the farmers I've talked to is we've had pretty good yields and a good crop year in general. If you look at production of peanuts in the U.S., you'll see that U.S. production was about 6.3 billion pounds. That was the August forecast anyway, and I think that was I think that bore out for October as well, whenever we had a better measurement. Georgia, of course, was always the biggest one. We had a bigger crop in North Carolina, and South Carolina was just down slightly, but a good peanut crop this year. And we had good prices. You know, we get paid through the farm program. Most of us participate in the PLC program, and that PLC rate looks like it was around $115 a ton for the 2020 crop. Now, remember, you get paid for the 2020 crop in October, so you should have just got your check for the 2020 crop last month if you're a peanut farmer. And the payment was good. You know, our market price, market year average price for 2020 was about $420 a ton. Looks like for 2021, it's probably going to be around the same level. We won't know for a while yet, but that's the price that these PLC payments are based off of course, and the reference price. It's the difference between the reference price of $535 a ton and whatever our marketing year average price is. So my guess is we're going to be looking at a marketing year average price for this season, very similar to the one that we saw for 2020. Okay, let's talk about tobacco for a minute. We mentioned earlier that because China was back, we saw a rebound in production. Now, I have to admit, who would have thought 5 or 10 years ago we would have been excited about 300 million pounds of flue-cured tobacco, but we were. Even though that's still a small crop, it was a lot better than what we had last year when our contracts only let us produce about 238 million pounds. As I mentioned earlier, the smallest crop in over 100 years. So we've rebounded some. I think the official estimate for the October forecast was 303 million pounds. What do we think about for the future for next year? Hopefully China is still in the market. And so we're good with regard to that. And there's also some talk of another manufacturer coming back into the U.S. market, which could potentially give us a 10 or 12% increase in contracted pounds for 2022. We certainly hope that's the case, but that would put us back up again over 300 million pounds for 2022, which would be really good news, especially for those of us in North Carolina, where we grow about 80% of the U.S. flue-cured tobacco. What are the issues looming out there? Well, they're not much different than the issues that we've talked about for years. There is a bill in Congress right now that would increase the federal excise tax on all tobacco products. It would increase it 100% on combustible cigarettes, but it would also it would place a tax on vapor products like e-cigarettes, heat not burn. It would increase the tax on other tobacco products like snuff or cigars or any of the others. So it looks like this could have a pretty substantial impact. The biggest impact is at the manufacturing level. For North Carolina, that's huge because we are a center of the manufacturing. Just for North Carolina alone, this could have a hit of over $1 billion in terms of our economy. The farm economy is buffeted a little bit by this because of all that flue-cured that we export. So it's not affected quite as much, but it still would impact our production some if this passes. There's some uncertainties around it, and some health advocates are concerned about it because they've not had a tax on these vapor products, which are considered a much lower health risk than a combustible cigarette. So if they tax vapor products, will that keep people from shifting away from combustible cigarettes or cause some people that have switched to vapor products to shift back to combustibles? And so that's one of those unintended consequences that could make the impact a little less on tobacco manufacturing and the farm economy. But of course, from a health advocate standpoint, this bill could actually have the opposite effect. It could push people back towards combustibles rather than causing them to quit. So it's a fairly controversial bill, but I think it has a very good chance of passing because this is one way that they can raise money for the new infrastructure bill. That's why this is being proposed. And tobacco is always an easy target because consumption doesn't respond a lot to prices. It responds some, but for every for every 10% increase in cigarette prices, you only get about a 3% decline in consumption. So it raises a lot more money than it does decrease consumption. So it's an easy target. So we'll see what happens. Okay, you can't talk about tobacco without talking about labor. And of course, that's important for a lot of crops in the Southeast. Sweet potatoes, all our fresh produce farmers are very heavily reliant on large quantities of labor. And so our Southeastern states are the biggest users of H-2A labor, except for California and Washington. North Carolina used to be the biggest user of H-2A. They've been surpassed by Georgia and Florida and California and Washington. If you look at 2021 in North Carolina, for example, our H-2A adverse effect wage rate was $13.15 an hour. In South Carolina, it was $11.81 an hour. I should have had Georgia up here too. I apologize for not having that up here. But there were 275,000 positions certified under the H-2A program in 2020. And of course, the H-2A program, if you're not familiar, is a special agricultural visa program that allows workers to come in from foreign countries and work in agriculture for a season up to 10 months. And the farmer has to provide transportation here, and they have to provide housing. So it's a good deal for these foreign workers. Yes, they work hard, but they're very reliable. They come in here, they can make $13 an hour in North Carolina, and they send all that money home because they have very little expenses here, and they don't pay taxes on it. So it's actually a good foreign aid program. But it's a very expensive program from our farmers to use because the wage rate's just one part of the cost. The housing and the transportation are other parts, but our farmers like it because of the reliability of the labor. But we saw some efforts under the previous administration to try to lessen some of the requirements to make it a little easier to use. Those didn't get through then, and they certainly are not going to happen now. So we're in kind of this uncertain situation. H-2A, the rate's going to continue to go up. The rules are not going to change. The real question is what's going to happen to immigration policy? Because if you remember, those of you that are my age, the last time we had a major reform in immigration policy was 1986. And I remember I was a county agent way back then. I was very young, by the way, but it was a long time ago. But I remember tobacco farmers in Eastern North Carolina were very concerned about the requirements under this immigration reform, because there was a lot of undocumented workers being used, and they started pulling mechanical harvesters out of the weeds. They started trying to make plans. And then what happened was, yes, it passed. It was put into law, but it really wasn't enforced very heavily. So within a year or two, we were back pretty much to the same situation where we were using in all of agriculture a lot of undocumented workers. And it's interesting, if you look at border crossings from Mexico, and this is from the American Immigration Council, and this goes all the way back to 2000. So this goes across party lines, both parties. Back then, look at that light blue portion. That's the estimated successful unlawful entries into the US. So those are people, almost 4 million of them back in 2000, that made it across the border without getting caught, and they came over to get a job. And so that's where our labor force came from. You see a lot of Border Patrol apprehensions, but it was a pretty good chance, better than 50-50 chance, that you were going to be able to make it across the border back then without being apprehended and get a job in the US. And so if you tried 2 or 3 times, you're probably going to make it in. And we weren't enforcing the immigration law very heavily in the US. So once you got here, you could get a job and you were pretty good. So we relied very heavily on that. And that tapered off around 2009, 2010. We saw it falling in the last Bush administration and then continue to fall under Obama. And under the Obama administration, there was stricter enforcement of immigration law. We saw in particular raids of ICE on slaughter facilities. We saw some shifts there. We saw a much lower number of successful entries into the US. And then when you moved into the Trump administration, that was a very, while it was happening before, it was very upfront and center there. And so you see that the number of successful unlawful entries fell dramatically in the Trump administration, and Border Patrol continued to apprehend a lot of folks too. And so as we moved from this beginning of this 20-year period to where we were, say, 10, 15 years ago, we had to start using H-2A workers because there just wasn't a supply of workers from outside the US otherwise. And so we saw farms in North Carolina. We were, as I said, used to be the biggest H-2A user. This is why, because the supply of undocumented workers was beginning to dry up. And H-2A was a good alternative, expensive, hard to use, but very reliable. And so the question going forward, and we see a lot of uncertainty, it's really not clear what this administration's policy is going to be. We see them saying, in many ways, come to the US, and then, we see them sending out the Border Patrol to turn them back when they do come. So I don't really know what the policy is going to be. But I would say this, that if you have a porous border, and you don't enforce your border, that's your policy. It doesn't matter what the law is. If you can get across the border, just like we did back in 2000, it didn't matter what the Immigration Reform Act of 1986 said, because it wasn't enforced. Basically, the policy was, if you could get across the border, you could get a job. I don't know whether we're moving back towards that or not, but we'll see. There will be continued attempts at immigration reform in Congress. It's an extraordinarily difficult thing to pass. It's hard to get agreement within one party, much less to get agreement across party lines. I saw this at the White House. It was difficult to even get agreement within the executive branch on what the policy should be. So I'm not really optimistic that we're going to see immigration reform in the next few years. It's just such a difficult issue, but maybe I'll be wrong. I have been before. But in my mind, the real question is whether or not the border is going to become porous again, and whether or not the current immigration law is going to be enforced. If it's not, then I think we'll see states like California, Arizona go back to using a lot of undocumented workers. They only reluctantly have adopted H-2A. They did not like the program because they were able to use undocumented workers. There were lower housing costs, no transportation costs. It's just a lot less expensive for them. So this is the question. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is right now. It doesn't seem like maybe the administration knows either at this point what their policy is going to be. But if the border does become porous again, that's going to be the effect, and California and Arizona will get those workers first. For us in the Carolinas, Virginia, Georgia, it probably means we're still going to have to use H-2A. And it probably means that H-2A is probably not going to change. The rules are not going to change. And the adverse effect wage rate may go to $14 for 2022. So we'll have to see. So wish they had better news there, but immigration is just a very difficult issue politically to solve. So with that, let me one more topic that's really important. I was about to forget. The environment and farm policy. The next farm bill is due in 2023. And so the theme is going to be very different from the last farm bill. The theme is going to be climate change. This is just a page of USDA's website. They now have a page on climate solutions. I guarantee you this page was not there whenever I was at the White House. This is new. And so we have seen a whole shift in emphasis. So the emphasis going into the 2023 Farm Bill is going to be on putting into place practices to mitigate climate change. It could be that they formalize some of the payments for carbon sequestration. We've seen private markets going up for this. There's a lot of issues with this, but I think we're going to see more private markets, and we're going to see more regulation and more government intervention there. And I think part of that will come in the form of some sort of incentive payments to farmers in the 2023 Farm Bill for carbon payments. And there'll be other things in there for climate change too. We'll see a new emphasis on conservation payments. That will be the theme of the upcoming Farm Bill. So stay tuned, because next year we'll start talking a lot about the 2023 Farm Bill, and it will be very important, just different from what we've had before. Other policy issues just to be aware of is, we thought the waters of the U.S. rule was behind us. It was defeated back in 2010. In fact, it has risen again. And now EPA says they're going to revive it. So this is one that farm organizations like American Farm Bureau are working very hard on. So just be aware of that, because it would be a pretty dramatic change in regulation if it happened. We saw some proposed estate tax rule changes that would have really made it more difficult for small businesses, in particular farms. This were things like stepped up basis. In other words, being able to increase the tax basis in your property when you pass it on to your children. It looks like right now that has been defeated, but we'll have to stay tuned. It may come back again. There was also some talk about changing the rules for like-kind exchanges and changing the thresholds for estate taxes, all of which would have made it a bit more difficult to pass the farm on to our kids. So we'll just have to stay tuned here. But right now, it looks like we may have escaped this one for the time being. Okay, now let's wrap up. Takeaways. Just in terms of farm income, I think our commodity markets will stay strong. No signs, at least right now. Something unexpected would have to happen for them not to be. We will have lower government payments. We have had a very profitable year this year, but our concern rolling into 2022 are just these rising input costs, in particular, especially fertilizer costs. You talk about trade, continued strong export opportunities across all commodities. The dollar remains at a relatively good level for exports. We're back trading with China again, which is good news for all commodities, but in particular for flue-cured tobacco. We've had a customer that hasn't bought here in a while that may re-enter the U.S. market for 2022 and could see a little increase in contracted pounds again. We'll have to wait and see, but a little optimism there. Again, China is going to continue to be a strong trade partner, but it's always going to be clouded by these strained relations with the U.S. And there'll be strong opportunities with other countries, especially those in Southeast Asia. So the export market will remain strong. Labor, well, I don't know exactly what to say. I think it's a pretty muddy picture, so we'll have to see. My guess is H-2A, no changes. We're going to roll forward with another increase in the adverse effect wage rate. The question is going to be, what's the border policy going to be? Is it going to be a porous border like we used to have and lax enforcement, or is it going to be something different? We'll just have to stay tuned and wait and see. Climate change is going to be the new theme of the Farm Bill, so stay tuned with that. And let me finish by coming back to our Executive Farm Management Program. Again, this program is 9.5 days of instruction. It focuses on business management, and it focuses on strategic planning, human resource management, financial management. Farmers really enjoy this program. It's very interactive. It's very hands-on. You get tools, and then you work with a team of other farmers on a case study farm throughout the program. And so the farmers really get into working with their teams on their case study. And at the end, they present their business plan for the case study farm, which, by the way, looks an awful lot like their own farms. They present that to a Shark Tank board made up of usually bankers and some of our program alumni and maybe some of our program faculty. And we actually choose a winner. So it gets really competitive, and the farmers really get into it. They love it. And I think it's one of the things that's unique about this program is just how interactive it is. You learn new tools to manage your business. You learn tools like how to successfully do succession planning between generations, and then you get to apply them before you leave. And so it's fun. And then we surround it with a lot of other stuff. We've had things like the head of Amazon Fresh Produce Division come talk to the program, the head of Wegmans Produce Division. We'll be including topics like big data, and we've done that before. We'll have some topics that are of particular interest to field crop farms, like peanut and cotton farms in particular. And then we'll have some topics that are of particular interest to large produce farms as well. So we'll have some breakout sessions. We really try to customize this program to fit the needs of the farmers that are in it. So I would encourage you, go to our website. It's real simple, go.ncsu.edu/EFM. Check the program out. You still got a week to get that discounted registration form in. If you have any questions about it, contact me. You can call me. I'll put my phone number up there in a minute and ask me questions about it. This is our initial class. This was our inaugural class of the Executive Farm Management Program. And so we got some really strong alumni. And if you go to the website, you can see alumni testimonials. And these alumni are some of our best advocates. They're our best recruiters for getting other folks in the program. It's filling up quickly now. So take a look at it. And if you have questions, give me a call. My number's up on the screen. Or you can call one of these alumni that you'll find the list on the website. And I'll bet you're going to know some of them. So with that, I will stop. Thank you for allowing me to present. Again, thank you to the Farm Credits for sponsoring this. We appreciate their support and very much appreciate the support that they provide for the Executive Farm Management Program. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Skipper.
Okay, thanks so much, Blake. You always provide a lot of great insight and have your pulse on a lot of different issues that are impacting agriculture. So we appreciate the presentation. We do not, that I can see, have any questions in the chat. Margaret, do you have any on your side that came direct to you?
No, I didn't. Does anybody have any questions now? You can unmute yourself and just ask Blake if you'd like.
Certainly. Are there any questions out there? There's got to be at least one or two. You can unmute and just ask.
I either put everybody to sleep or we just made it crystal clear. I'm not sure which it was.
There's a good question in the chat from Weston. What keeps Dr. Brown? What keeps Dr. Brown awake at night?
Well, at my age, not too much, Weston, but I think really the big issues on all farmers' minds, and it's the one that on mine, the immediate issue is what's going on with these input prices. The supply chain snafus that we talked about and fertilizer prices just escalating out the roof. If I were a farmer, that's what I would be most concerned about. And I wish I had the answer. I wished I could say, yeah, you better go out and buy those inputs now if that's the best policy. Well, I don't know that's for sure. I mean, because we could get into trouble doing that too. But this is the issue that we got to look at really strongly, and we need to think carefully about our plans for 2022 because of the input prices. Wished I knew the answer, but that's the big one on my mind anyway, and I think it is on all farmers' minds.
Any other questions out there? You can unmute. Okay, it looks like we've got one coming in here.
Ooh, what soil condition policies are being made and what's happening to protect pollinators? I'm sorry, James, I don't know the answer to that. There usually are some provisions in the Farm Bill around beekeepers because they're so important. The pollinators are so important to our crops. I don't know what those provisions will be, and I haven't heard anything in particular about those right now. In terms of soil condition, I'm not quite sure what you mean, but in terms of soil conservation policies, through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, I think we will see more money in that area than we saw in the last Farm Bill. So I think we'll see more focus on conservation. So I know that's not exactly what you asked. I hope that helps out just a little bit. Here's another one from Justin. With China having a large influence with U.S. pork, is there a threat of China's own production influencing our pork industry? Well, yes, it certainly does influence our pork industry to the extent that, whenever China lost much of their swine herd, they had to import pork. Pork is so important to the Chinese people. The government was very concerned about escalating pork prices. And they knew that if people didn't get pork to eat, they'd be very unhappy. And I'm not being facetious. This was a big, big issue. And so they, even with the trade war, they started importing a huge amount of our pork. So it did have a big effect. I think moving forward, what we'll see is that exports of U.S. pork to China will tailor off. And we'll go back to a situation where basically China, before the swine flu, they were importing about 5% of their pork needs. Well, that's still a huge amount of pork. And all that pork before swine fever was coming basically mostly from Denmark or Europe, from the US, and to some extent Brazil, because Brazil has a pretty healthy swine industry too. My guess is we'll go back to a situation like that, where China imports some pork, but they produce most of it themselves, which means they'll have to import a lot of feedstuffs like soybeans and corn, and most of that will come from the US and Brazil. So I think we're going back to a situation like we were probably in before, would be my best guess. Okay, let's see, another question here. Anything to keep the tick population down this coming spring? Don't know about that since I'm an economist, but I'm all for it. Any other questions in terms of policy or economics? So, here's one from Tanya. In terms of farmland, what impacts are you seeing with North Carolina's increasing population and encroachment on farmland? We're seeing a huge surge in that. During let me start out this way, put it in context. There are not many parts of North Carolina that are not impacted by urban development. Certainly in the mountains, virtually all the land is more impacted by urban development than anything to do with agriculture. In the Piedmont, for the most part, our land prices in the Piedmont, urban in development or speculation about future development is the biggest impact on land prices in the Piedmont. And when you get to Eastern North Carolina, it's still a big impact, but we do have areas of Eastern North Carolina that are still primarily influenced by farmland values, the value of that land for agricultural production. During the Great Recession, we saw the amount of land in Eastern North Carolina that was influenced by urban encroachment decrease because development went way down. We saw it during the recession. But now that we're out of the recession and we're seeing a boom time, we're seeing that development from the Raleigh area creep east again. We're seeing a lot of people with basically who now realize they don't have to live in the city. They can work remotely. We see a lot of them coming out to live a rural lifestyle, which is putting upward pressure on prices in a lot of our rural landscape. So yes, urban encroachment is huge in North Carolina. I don't see it letting off. And just the fact that people can work remotely now means that, we're going to continue to see that trend. I could name several cases of people that I have met who now live in rural areas, he said, wow, we realized we didn't have to live where we worked. And so we moved out to have a small farm. We wanted to live in the country. And we're going to continue to see that, that pace. And so, yes, our urban encroachment is going to continue to be a big issue in North Carolina. Hope that answers that question. Okay. I think I may have scrolled past the last one, Margaret. You may have to help me with that one. So are there some more questions there? I think we still got some time. So
Yes, we have 4 minutes and it looks like there are a few questions.
okay.
We could probably just take them in order. I see one from Pepe who says, are the Brazil and Argentina inventories of soybeans?
You know, Pepe, I'm not sure. I should have probably looked at that. You know, Brazil had a little bit smaller soybean crop, which helped us. You know, they are right in the middle of their spring crop right now. They planted September and that crop will be coming off in January. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not up to par on what that crop looks like. I don't think it's anticipated on being a much larger crop in January anyway. But very important. Brazil's our big competitor in corn and soybeans, but also in crops like cotton and also pork and poultry production. So sorry, I'm not more up on that one.
All right, and then we have a trade question. It says, Dr. Brown, you mentioned that we should focus on other trade partners other than China. Who do you think we should be keeping an eye on? I know you mentioned Southeast Asia countries, but what of the growing population in India?
Yes, India has been a tough one to crack. There's a lot of convoluted trade policies. And what I learned when I was in DC is that some of the most difficult trade relations and difficult negotiations we have are with India. And so they have a lot of protectionist policies, but I think India is one that is worthy of the US Trade Office and exporters to continue to work on because they have a growing economy and an exploding population. While China's population is tailing off, especially, you know, with their aging population, India's continues to grow, and India is healthy economic growth right now. So we need to continue to focus on India, and I think the U.S. Trade Office does, but it is a difficult one. It is. Other ones, as I mentioned, let's not forget about our neighbors, Mexico and China. The USMCA basically updated a lot of things in NAFTA. While it has some problematic areas for some of our produce producers, especially in Georgia, for a lot of products, it increased trade and opened up some export opportunities for us. So Canada and Mexico still very important. The European Union's always important. They got lots of trade issues too. I think we've got an administration now which has a fairly friendly policy towards the European Union, so that may actually help some trade opportunities there as well. But yep, Southeast Asia, you mentioned a lot of population growth there. One of the things to keep in mind for Southeast Asia, and going back to African swine fever, countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia they were mostly smallholder pig production. They were small farmers growing most of their pork, and they eat a lot of pork just like China. They didn't have a very large commercial industry, and those smallholders were devastated by African swine fever, and it's been difficult for them to come back. So there are export opportunities for U.S. pork and poultry, because poultry is a cheaper meat for these countries in Southeast Asia, in part because of the African swine fever, but also in part because their economies are growing, although these economies still have a lot of snafus with COVID because they have fairly low vaccination rates. But yeah, Southeast Asia is very important, especially for pork and poultry, I think, right now. Hopefully that
Okay, we're almost at 1 o'clock, so I'll ask you one more quick question, Blake. This comes from Annie Baggett. What are your thoughts on short-term economic outlook within the state? What's working, opportunities? Is there anything you've seen in North Carolina that, like Skipper said, you're on the pulse of the issues? Are there any emerging issues in the state that we should be watching?
And so I'm assuming you're talking about agricultural issues. So with that in mind, you know, we talked about urban encroachment. Urban encroachment can be a real problem in terms of land for agriculture, but urban growth has created some real opportunities for our local food industry. And the pandemic accelerated some of that. We actually saw local food markets grow during the pandemic at a very healthy rate as people turned to buy especially local meat, when we had the supply chain issues. And as our population grows and as people become more aware of local food opportunities, then I think that creates more opportunities for our local food producers. That's not a huge segment economically of our state, but in the Piedmont and mountains, in these urban areas, it's very important. And we do have farmers that are making a pretty decent living growing local food and taking advantage of these markets. So that's one example of that anyway. So.
Awesome. There were a couple questions we didn't get to, so I would just encourage those people that asked the questions to email Blake. I'm sure he would be happy to field a few questions. They look interesting, but otherwise I think we're out of time for this webinar.
Well, thank y'all so much.
Thanks, Blake. Thanks, Margaret. And I would encourage everyone to learn more about the Executive Farm Management Program if you're not familiar with it. Farm Credit is a big supporter of it. We've had a lot of members that have gone through that program and have really seen a lot of great value. So with that, thanks for joining us today, and I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Can I just add one last plug?
Certainly.
Shameless plug. For if you're concerned about the issues of 2022 and how you cope with them, sign up for the Executive Farm Management Program, and we'll talk more about it. Thank y'all.